Welcome, everyone. It's good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. My name is Stephen Feder. I work with the United Church of Canada doing webinars and continuing education, and I'm kind of your technical host today. So delightful to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking some time out of the middle of July to join us for this important topic. Just a couple of things about Zoom today before we jump into our program. First of all, as you can see, probably I am recording this, and we'll put a copy of the recording up at YouTube probably within a few days or so. And then a link to the recording will be on the Alum website. We have about 61 people registered for today. Now, so far we've got 27 in the room. So I don't know how many will be here, but it looks like it could be a large enough crew that it's not going to be convenient to invite people to open their mics and ask questions. So we'll use the chat for that today. If you haven't used the chat in Zoom before, let me tell you how to find it. Move your mouse over top of where my picture is, and you'll see all of the Zoom icons. The menu comes up at the bottom of the Zoom window. Look for the one that says chat. And if you don't see it, look for one that says more, and it's probably collected into a bunch of them there. Click that and you'll see a chat, and that's where we'll collect your questions. As we go through, Helen Blair is going to be interviewing Frank. The two of them will be conversing together, and add your questions. Ask what you want to know. As they go through it, I may stop them and interrupt them and say, somebody has asked in the chat. And my job here is to kind of watch the chat and make sure that we don't lose your questions. They're important, and that's why we're here. The plan for today is to take about an hour with Frank, and then we'll say goodbye to him. We're going to go into small groups for about 10 minutes or so, just to kind of process what we've heard and what we think the next steps might be, and then come back together and for the last 15 minutes or so, check in around how do we work with the information we've received, and what do we need to do next, and what are the things we have to learn about next in order to do this well. So that's kind of the shape of the day. If you have any questions before we begin, please put them in the chat. But in the meantime, I'd like to invite you just to join me in a moment of prayer. I'm in pastoral ministry as well as doing this work for the United Church of Canada. And so here I am sitting at my desk where I have been leading Zoom worship services every Sunday since the middle of March. And every time we begin worship, we light a candle, just to kind of remember that we are held by the light. And so take a moment, and let me invite you to take a moment and just pause and think about the impact that this pandemic has had on you and on the institution that you serve. Think about the people you serve and the continuing education needs that are emerging because of all of the things that are happening around us. Think about the changes that are happening in our institutions because of the renewed emphasis on continuing education from the ATS. And then pause and remember that we gather not just as colleagues, but we gather as people of God. We'll light this candle and give thanks for the light that warms us and guides us and it strengthens us and draws us forward. Friends, let us pray. Loving God, thank you. Thank you for the ministry to which you call us. Thank you for the people we serve and the ways that they are called to empower the church. Thank you for the ATS and the ways in which it unites so many denominations. Be with us today. Strengthen us, help us to listen, help us to discern as we reflect on the place of continuing education within the work of the wider church. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So let me turn things over to my colleague Helen Blair, who's going to be our host and interviewer today. So Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Steve began with the sublime, lighting a candle, beginning in prayer. I'll interject with a little bit of the ridiculous. I have 2 dogs who tend to whine a lot at this time of day. I've just given them peanut butter filled Kong, so let's hope that keeps them quiet. But if you see me occasionally looking a little distracted off to the side or my arm dipping down to scratch an ear, you'll know what's going on there. I'm Helen Dwyer, and I'm the Director of Continuing Education at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. I'm also a member of ALUM. And in a past life, I was on staff at ATS, where our guest today serves as Executive Director. I continue to keep an eye on what's going on at ATS for several reasons, not least of which is my interest in how continuing education and lifelong learning programs can help theological schools and denominations sharpen their cutting edge and lean into the future of theological education. The mission of the association is to, quote, promote the improvement and enhancement of theological schools to the benefit of communities of faith and the broader public. And that intended benefit to communities of faith and the broader public is certainly shared by those of us who are in the business of lifelong learning. A brief word on how today's conversation started out. The membership of the association just approved a major revision to the standards that are used to accredit member schools and approve their degree programs. And we'll be getting into the weeds of that revision during our conversation today. But listening in on some of the conversation that was happening leading up to this historic vote and looking at the major shift from the old standards, with which I was very familiar, to these new stripped down, very lean standards, it occurred to me that both the content and the culture of the shift has implications for the work I and my colleagues in ALUM do. So I asked Frank if he'd be willing to be in conversation with me about this, and I was absolutely delighted when he said yes. I mean, Frank's a lot of fun to talk to anyways, and every time we talk, we're like, why don't we do this more often? So I'll just give you a brief word of introduction. Reverend Dr. Frank Yamada began as Executive Director of ATS in July 2017. In that facility, he oversees the work of both the association and the Commission on Accrediting. Prior to ATS, he served as McCormick's 10th president, the first Asian American to lead a PCUSA, a Presbyterian Church USA seminary. His tenure there was marked by increasing diversity in McCormick's student body and creative engagement with the shifting realities of theological education. His scholarly background is in Hebrew Bible Old Testament, and he's authored and edited numerous books and articles on both cross-cultural and feminist hermeneutics. But today he writes and speaks primarily on the future of the church and theological education. He's ordained in the PCUSA, and in my experience, his work and his sensibilities successfully attend to the academy, the church, and the broader public and where they intersect. So welcome, Frank. So much fun to have you on screen today.
Thank you, Helen.
So when I initially talked to you and we're waiting for the vote to happen, we were talking a little bit about the culture and so on, and then the vote happened. So like so many other organizations, denominations, institutions, you held your biennial meeting virtually. And it was, I'm sure, a dicey situation because you've got this major vote. You don't have the typical kind of networking and professional esprit de corps that's usually built at these face-to-face meetings. But it turned out to be a remarkable vote. So could you just recap what happened at the biennial meeting just to kind of set the stage? I know a lot of folks here have very little association with ATS and the commission. So just kind of give us a picture of what happened.
Surely. First of all, to kind of highlight one of the themes that's in the standards, there were 3 themes that were part of the biennial meeting, and those themes were quality, clarity. In an earlier version, it was actually simplicity, but we didn't want simplicity to get mixed up with being simplistic, so we went with clarity. But it was quality, clarity, and flexibility. And that last word especially was something that we not only was a theme in the standards, it became a theme for the spring, as I'm sure it was for many of you. So basically, somewhere around March is when we began, or actually a little bit earlier in late February, we began to get some inkling that we were going to have to make a major shift. So a biennial meeting takes us about 18 months to plan. It's usually about a 450-person face-to-face on-site meeting at some hotel or convention center with multiple components and multiple programs going on at the same time. And because of the pandemic, we, in about the space of about 2 months, had to convert this to an online meeting. So the idea of being flexible, which is a theme within the standards, was something that we had to embody as a staff. So the things that were converging on this moment were pretty significant. As we approached our late June meeting time, not only were we dealing with pandemic, but all of the uprisings and protests that were emerging in the wake of the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis were emerging. So that actually created another pivot for us with our biennial meeting planning, and we hosted a two-part series of events that were biennial events leading up to the biennial, but we're also part of a biennial open forum. So we had one on Black Lives Matter, where we had an august panel of theologians, Black theologians who were sharing about what is the theological work that needed to be done at this time. And then an open forum the day before the actual business part of the biennial meeting. So all of these things were coming to a head as we were trying to have this we called it a once in a generation vote. Basically, the standards have only been revised in this major way 3 times in the history of ATS, and this was the 3rd time. So we had this major once in a generation vote on a new set of standards with these converging realities coming in all the time, and this quick pivoting that we had to do into a biennial meeting. And many of you maybe can relate to this. When you're creating an online event, especially when you have a lot of possible contingencies in terms of what can happen, we had to actually plan for some of those contingencies and what might happen. And so we had all of these contingency plans, everything going up. We had this whole process by which potential amendments could happen. And we had the motion for the standards, for the new standards to be approved. And there was not a single call for an amendment. It was just stunning. The chair, who is Leanne Van Dyke, the chair of the Board of Commissioners, we just sat there in stunned silence as there was no amendments being put forward from the membership. And
check to make sure that everybody's internet was working, right? 0 amendments.
That's right.
So, that's amazing.
There were no amendments. No, it was really amazing. And really what was the result of that, or the reason why that happened, was this had been really a 2-year process of listening to the membership, where the majority of schools in the membership had been engaged at certain points with either prior to the writing of the standards or after the draft of the standards had come out. So all of that good work kind of came to a head, and there were no amendments. The next day, the membership voted, and the vote was 198-1 in favor of the new standards. It was really an amazing, an outcome that was far exceeded our expectations. So is that enough to give you the background about what happened? And
yeah, so I mean, there's so many things that come up in your narrative. One is the mandate for flexibility, which is something we can all relate to. You know, in the privacy of your own homes, raise your hand if you had to pivot and put all of your stuff online, or recraft all of your programs because of the situation, or develop new ones because of either the pandemic or because of Black Lives Matter or something else. And it does seem that this idea of quality, clarity, flexibility is a really interesting framework for understanding the work of theological education right now. Theological education doesn't necessarily have a history of participating in even 2 out of 3 of those things. It is a weighty and historic set of institutions that often value the way things have been done. But the way the new standards are operating, that's not going to happen anymore. So talk to us a little bit about the content shift in the standards. The old ones, which I remember from doing a kabillion visits as a visitor on accreditation visits, versus the new version. Yeah,
let me highlight 3 themes, and then also get to a theme that I think will be meaningful for this group, the Alum group. So 3 themes that kind of emerged both in conversations prior to any writing of any standards when we were listening to the membership, and then emerged in the draft of the standards in response to the membership and what the membership had asked for. But these three themes are kind of characterize these new standards. So first of all, just to let you know, to give you a little bit of context, the standards from which all of our schools operated in 2019 and for the first half of 2020 were over 98 pages long, with addendums and other things that they are over 100 pages long. And these new standards are 18 pages. 18 pages and 22 if you include the preamble. But these three themes that, and one of the reasons we were able to get it to this is what we mean by clarity or simplicity. One of the reasons we were able to get to a more simple set of standards was, first of all, we went from, instead of outlining specific practices, like for example, in the old standards, we had a whole standard on distance education. Which is really a mode or a practice of education. It's not itself a pointer of quality or a principle of quality in education. But we moved from practices to principles. And so because of that, we were able to incorporate or be able to accommodate a host of different practices that schools engage under certain educational principles of quality. So practices or principles versus practices. The second was elegant simplicity. As I named before, we actually heard from feedback from schools that these standards are actually very well written. They hang together very nicely. They're elegantly written. So elegant simplicity was a theme and a value that we brought to these standards. And the third was contextualized quality. Because we're not focusing the standards on specific practices, but on principles, it really then becomes a way by which schools can embody those principles through contextualized quality, or quality based on their own school's mission and their own school's context. So these are three major themes that are throughout the standards. They were also part of the process. One additional theme that I wanted to highlight for this particular group, you'll see that there's actually a standard on student learning and formation. It's standard 3. And actually it's part of a larger structure for the standards. So if you look at the standards, they're kind of bookends on either end of standard 1 and 2, which is mission integrity, planning and evaluation. So the institutional ethos or institutionalness of the school. And then on the last two standards, 9 and 10, you have governance and administration and institutional resources. And in the middle, standards 3 through 8, really the central core of the standards, the focus is on students and on student learning and formation and student programs and personnel. So in some ways, these are really student-focused standards, and particularly with an emphasis on formation. And I think one of the things that would be important for this group to think about is, if you think about it, at least when I was at McCormick, the way we tended to think of continuing education was, this is what we did with alums. This is what we did through our development or our advancement shop. It was after people had graduated, after we had done their formation, so to speak. And it really was kind of an erroneous way to think of continuing education or ongoing adult formation or ongoing formation of our constituents and of our alums and students. So one of the things that I think the standards really send a signal to, particularly for those who do continuing ed and for those who are invested in student formation, is this long trajectory of students before they come to seminary, when they're thinking vocationally about what they want to do, or they're doing what they want to do. We play a very small role in that formation, and it's really focused on education in seminaries. But again, part of what seminaries do is they continue that through continuing education, ongoing formation, whether it's priestly or pastoral formation in that context, or ongoing professional developments in whatever role they're working in. So if we can think of formation as this long, ongoing piece, and that the seminary actually has many touch points in that formation, that's maybe a different way that we can begin to rethink or reformat or rethink the idea of continuing education and its role in theological education, formally, at least in terms of seminary degree formation and that kind of thing. So, those are the themes that I think I wanted to emphasize. Yeah.
Yeah, I put up on the screen the standards that you're talking about, the student learning and formation, and I did highlight 3.5. It's my favorite of the standards given the day job that I have. The school demonstrates an understanding of learning and formation as lifetime pursuits by helping students develop motivations, skills, and practices for lifelong learning. This is a really interesting shift, and what the hot take, if you will, of what you just said that I'm taking from this is that the standards understand formation for ministerial practice as being a lifelong pursuit in which theological education plays an episodic part. So the degree program that somebody participates in is like a core sample of something that's ongoing for a long time. And that means that one's formation, one's learning, one's ability to grow into one's vocational identity, practices, and knowledge does not end with the conferring of a degree. So that is a way that the standards make the case for the importance of lifelong learning. Now, what this seems to argue here is that it's the responsibility for theological schools to intentionally support that lifelong learning, not only by building the appetites for it, but also providing opportunities. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. And you stop sharing your screen just a second, but I think that is the case. Now, one of the things that it talks about, and again, I think this is what's really unique about the standards, is that it's actually talking specifically about the central role of student formation in theological education. And what you said is exactly right. There is a way in which the institution should be thinking holistically about that formation and not simply just about what happens in the 2 to 3 years or the 3 to 5 years that you have a student, but it should be thinking holistically, not just in terms of duration, but in terms of the context in which the students work and live in as well. So I think that's the emphasis. Now, what that actually looks like in different schools will be different. And again, think of the standards as a principle. You know, how does a school want to embody that principle? How does it want to think of that principle? And that's where, so to speak, that you'll begin to see what schools will do with it. In some cases, that may mean that you have designated personnel, or you have a designated place where continuing education happens. In some cases, it may be partnerships that are done with churches or with judicatories or with other things. But the awareness that the institution should have is that it's part of this lifelong process. So you're pointing to the right emphasis in that particular standard.
So talk to us then about the spirit of the shift in the standards. You've talked about these 3 principles versus practices, elegance, simplicity, and contextualized quality as being overarching themes that are present in those standards. Where's the weight going to be placed in a school's evaluation when a team goes in? And what then is the responsibility of the school? Because it's no longer having a checklist and being able just to say, we've got this many volumes in the library, this many staff, this kind of an endowment, these are our degree programs meeting these criteria. It seems like there's a very different emphasis placed on the institution as they're thinking about holding themselves accountable to the formation of students.
Right. And so a lot of that's going to happen, again, for those of you who've been through a reaccreditation process, a lot of that's going to happen in the self-study process. But it will also happen in the evaluation process as well. So the self-study process, for those of you who haven't been through one or haven't been through one recently, is the process by which the school ascertains and makes a case for how it's meeting the standards. And What's going to be a little bit different, what we hope is, one, that these self-studies can be shorter because there's just fewer standards. But it is going to put a lot of weight on the schools to demonstrate how they're achieving these particular standards. So that's where it will be an interesting conversation with evaluation teams when we get on the ground and say, for example, the standard that you point out under standard 3.5, if a school says, oh yeah, we did this through this, and then there's really no evidence to show that they're achieving outcomes of how they're trying to demonstrate this particular principle or this standard, then the team will have some way to kind of go back at it, go back to the school and say, hey, well, here's some ways that you can think about improving. But again, in the self-study process, usually that happens up front on the school's end. The school will usually say, you know what, having looked at this standard, we need to do a better job about this. And so some ways the self-study and the the reaccreditation process acts as a way for the school to improve itself. I don't know if that gets to the essence of your question. You're really asking about evaluation teams, Helen, but I think what I was trying to point to is the role that the self-study plays in the reaccreditation process and how that actually helps the school to say, well, here's how we're actually doing vis-a-vis the standards.
So one of the things that folks on this call are interested in, we've got a couple of different kinds of people on our call today. We have people who are doing this work from within ATS accredited institutions. We've got folks who are not in those institutions, and those are typically people working in freestanding institutions of continuing education or denominational offices. For those of us who are in member schools, historically, we haven't had to care too much about the evaluation office process because continuing education, lifelong learning wasn't really part of what was considered or looked at. It was a much more quantifiable approach to evaluation. And for folks in denomination offices or other places, like, why should they care? It seems to me, though, when you and I were chatting before this conversation, that the standards now require schools to be a lot more student-focused in their approach to understanding the effectiveness of their work. And if they are more student-focused and formation-focused, then these graduates of these institutions need people who are going to continue to support this formation, both inside the walls and outside the limits of a degree program. So say a little bit about stuff that's going to help us make the case for the importance of our offices.
Yeah, and for those of you who are on this this webinar, Helen and I had a bit of a brief conversation and did some back and forth to kind of rehearse things that we might want to talk about. And in that conversation, one of the things that I really remember was one of the things that we often hear from folks and from schools. For example, librarians with the library standard. It used to be standard 4 in our old standards. There were certain things in the standards where they would say, well, you need this, you need this. And it was basically leverage they could go to their dean with and say, well, this ATS and the standards say that you have to have this, so we need this for the library. With this move to principles, some of that leverage is not emphasized in the same kind of way, I would say. And what I can say that the standards don't do is they don't say, let's make a case for my job in an institution. But what these standards do talk about, and this is what my advice to folks who are in ATS schools who are part of this group in Alum, is what I think it suggests is that, particularly with those who are doing continuing education, again, in most of the shops that I've seen in schools, they usually put continuing education as this function of the alumni office. This is what you do with alums. You bring them to campus every once in a while, you have some good speakers, you do these programs. But it's seen as an external piece to the core mission of the school in some ways. It's kind of the extension to the audience or to the alumni of the institution, alumni and alumna of the institution. But the core focus of the educational programming. What I think this emphasis on formation does is it says to all of you who are in continuing education, is it provides you that link to the core mission of the school. And that is, if the core mission of the school is to form, maybe again, a large degree of that formation is educational, but still, if this emphasis on formation is such a critical piece of these standards, then continuing education is this vital link of formation with students after they, quote unquote, leave the walls of the school, but they're continuing. And that's, I think, the essence of what 3.5 is pointing out, is that formation continues. So the link to your, quote unquote, jobs, your places of employment, your offices, the link to your vocation is actually in these standards with really at the core of what schools are supposed to be doing, and that is student formation. So that's a significant shift, and I don't know what that will mean for schools structurally. If that will mean that some schools begin to structure their continuing ed office more in relationship to student affairs or something like that. These standards wouldn't make those kinds of recommendations, but there is a significant link that these standards are making between what you all do in continuing education and that ongoing understanding of learning as a lifetime pursuit, as an ongoing piece of the formation that schools do and what schools focus on. So again, that doesn't necessarily provide job security, and you can go to your dean or your president and say, you know, hey, look, the standards say my job needs to exist, but it does say that there's an important function and role that your offices and that your jobs have done that are critical to what at least the standards say is part of student formation.
That's really helpful, especially part of the fabulous meandering conversation we had in preparation for this was to do kind of a historical view of the quantum shifts theological education has experienced even just in the last half century. So, you know, fast forwarding from major disruptions in the 60s, early 70s, and the change of location of the church in the civic order, as you and I were chatting, we saw more recently the bust of the .com era, the 08-09 recession. Today, not only are we dealing with a complete shift in the delivery of theological education and the services provided by the graduates, meaning pastoral care and worship and so on, but there will be massive economic fallout from COVID as a result of this. And each time one of these shifts has happened, there have been economic implications for people who do the education and the foreign ministry for the institutions, whether they're denominational or educational. Each time, student services, not faculty, take the major hit. So this does put us in an interesting position, but one of the things that was so helpful in the conversation we had is we talked about the spirit of quality and clarity and flexibility as it helps us understand the work that we're doing, not just the jobs and services we function in, but how we understand ourselves versus this deeper trajectory of theological education and formation of people for ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Maybe I'll share just a brief narrative about kind of my journey through this. During the .com bubble, I was at Princeton Seminary, so you know, big endowment, a school that didn't see much upheaval in terms of its finances during the .com, but during the 2008-2009 financial disruption and the market crash, I was actually a faculty person at a small Episcopal school in Evanston, Illinois. And actually ahead of the crash in the spring of 2008, this school declared financial exigency. Now the very strange story that I could tell some other time was that I was actually a junior faculty person that was on this board committee. I was a faculty person on this, a faculty rep on the board, a committee that helped to make this decision. So I knew it was coming. So I was at the board meeting. I was also going up for tenure and promotion at the same board meeting. So I was granted tenure and promotion. I was the first person of color to ever be tenured at this school, and it's over 150-year history. And then in 13 minutes and 45 seconds, the school declared exigency and terminated the faculty. So I carried a distinction that I have probably the shortest duration or shortest length of time between tenure and promotion and termination to probably in the history of the academy. But all that to say is what it did for me as a faculty person is it just kind of opened my eyes to the fact that the theological education for which I had been trained was not the theological education that I was going to be moving into. And so I really began to think about how I could retool myself. And I actually took, as my next job, I was a center director for an Asian American Ministries program at McCormick Seminary, and I was part-time faculty. So I was teaching and I was administering this center. But what that taught me was something that I've noticed, and it's been pretty much from 2008 on, that there's been this growing tendency both among faculty, to see it among faculty, but also among administrators, where schools are having to become more agile, more adaptable, to be able to shift more quickly and pivot more quickly. And this last experience in the spring of 2020 is just another case and example where schools have had to pivot very quickly in the middle of these circumstances. So I think what that means professionally is that our institutions are in these states of really deep and profound change. And my sense of what institutions value from employees and from people who work within those institutions are really people who not just have expertise. That was the seminary for hundreds of years, expertise, particularly within a field. But now we're seeing that what's really needed in schools is adaptability, flexibility, agility, the ability for people to be able to think new things and to do new things. And that's a big culture shift. So all that to say is when I see that environment and when I see where all of you are working, my experience with continuing ed offices, you are often on the front lines of change because you're working in contexts that are changing rapidly. It's those very skills that I think are the things that institutions need most this time, is they really need people who are able to adapt and to think quickly and to be able to be agile in what they do. So this is just a new reality that we're living in some ways. And there's much that's been written on it, but we've gone from a very dramatic and deeply changing set of institutions to institutions that are now even accelerating that change in light of the recent pandemic. And what that requires is in some ways a whole host of professional abilities that really aren't things that seminaries had trained us to do or to be. So all that to say though is that I think that there are those places and for those functions and those areas of professional life where you have to, you're required to be more flexible, be more adaptable, be able to adjust to realities that are on the ground. Those are the kinds of things that I think that are going to be very important for institutions and for your positions, quite frankly.
I'm going to interrupt for a second because there's a couple of questions on the chat that I wanted to draw your attention to, and one of them really is pushing a little harder on the things you've just been talking about, Frank. I'm looking at Nancy's comment about money, and I'm thinking about Jesus' comment that where your money is, there your heart is. We've often felt as continuing educators that there's not a whole lot of money that either comes into the school or goes out into continuing education through this process. How does this change budgeting? How does this change our institutions? And what's the financial accountability here that's going to be needed if schools live into this new philosophy?
One, I do think that there's a couple ways to think of this or to look at it. One is I do think one of the impacts of the pandemic is there's significant financial impact that I think that doesn't get as much play, but it's something that we have to think about because quite honestly, I think that the financial impact is going to be a significant one, one that we're going to have to think about, one that institutions are going to have to think about. That doesn't answer quite the question in terms of where does an institution put its resources, because in terms of where it prioritizes its resources. But schools are really at this point thinking about the fall and the future impact that this financial fallout will have on their recruiting, on their institutional life. Right now, those schools that have been dependent on endowments have been, for the most part, if you were to ask them maybe 5 months ago, they would have been a little more worried. But there's still some evidence that the market seems to be a little overpriced. So there is some sense that there could be some future disruption as well financially for those schools. But really what schools are looking at is the bottom line impact of what the fall might bring should they not be able to have students in their seats in classrooms, which increasingly looks like one of the realities that schools are having to address and having to face. So having said that, the broader umbrella is that there is a financial, there are some big financial realities that schools are facing and thinking about, and schools are having to think about the adjustments to their budgets. Schools are also having to think about the long-term impact of this on financial resources and their school's financial viability. So that's significant. So to get more though to your question, if we look historically, and we've actually begun to do some studies about how schools responded in past financial crises, one of the things that we learned from 2000 and 2008, 2009 is that schools actually did not pull back as much from faculty. They didn't let go of as many faculty, but where we saw a lot of cuts were in other places in staff. Helen mentioned student affairs was a place that got hit hard. And what ended up happening in that with institutions is that then faculty began to take larger administrative roles. So some of that began to morph the way that faculty actually began to do their work. Again, this doesn't get to the heart of the question, but it's beginning to answer that when schools pulled back in 2000, 2008, 2009, what they tended to, where they put their money, so to speak, was where they thought their educational mission was, which was, again, mostly in their faculty. We're yet to see whether this pandemic and the financial implications of this pandemic are playing out in the same way that 2008, 2009 are. But we've been doing some research and we've been studying schools, and so we're tracking it. But that's what we learned from 2008, 2009. And
yeah, I think most of us on the call would agree that's certainly our anecdotal experience too. And what that has meant for continuing educators is that our jobs moved from full-time to part-time, or from full-time to occasional, or a few lectures a year. And that somehow continuing education was not seen as a core part of the mission of the school. And I guess what we're wondering is if the standards are changing, will the core mission of the school change, and will there be dollars to follow that? I think that's what Nancy means by financial accountability.
Yeah, no, I get that. So again, I think it, in terms of, while I do see this shift in 3.5 in particular, towards student formation and lifelong learning, 3.5 in particular with lifelong learning, I think it would be probably inaccurate to say that this is a major theme throughout the standards. This is a theme where the standards have incorporated lifelong learning into formation. So in terms of whether that means the dollars then go to, say, continuing education, that's hard to say. And I don't think that the standards are there to kind of say, this is, the standards aren't going to be so determinative about how schools will spend their money that way. But I think where a case could be made, and this is, again, this doesn't relate so much to the standards as it does to the realities of what theological schools are doing. And one of the reasons why I think this 3.5 was written is that there has been this theme that we've noticed among schools, that there has been this increased activity of schools reaching out to congregations, to local judicatories, to denominational, regional bodies, to see what it is that their leadership needs for theological, what it is their leadership needs, so that they could be attentive to that in their theological education. We've seen this, for example, we did a several $1 million Lilly project on educational models. One of the models that we studied was this emerging model of competency-based theological education. Now, people were really intrigued by the whole idea of moving more towards competencies. But one of the brilliant things that the competency-based folks did was where they began to develop this list of competencies that became the basis of these new curricula, was they really reached out to local congregations. They reached out and they connected to their churches and their judicatories to see what their leadership needed. That's what I see as the essential piece that your offices provide. It's that link to the church. Mm-hmm. It's that link to the congregations, to the link to the communities of faith. And that's an underlying theme that we see going on with schools, that we see going on with programs. And you see it in the standards, but it's, again, that's not answering directly in terms of Nancy's question about, will the money follow? I think the money follows when there's vitality to mission. And that's what we've seen with the competency-based programs, is the money follows to that trajectory of being involved and engaged in communities of faith, because that's where the vitality of their programs have gone. And so that may be again, a different way to say, when schools see that happening, then they invest in that, yes. But if they're investing in a program or an office, that's a harder case to make. So that's where I see the energy, is when schools see vitality related to mission, especially, for example, if it's mission in the context of a particular group of leaders, for example, then the money tends to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that this seems to be saying is, first of all, that unfortunately we don't get a clear mandate from the standards that says, hey, y'all, you need a continuing ed or lifelong learning office, which would be great, but the stripped down version of the new standards doesn't really give that kind of clear mandated leverage to most things, except the things that we already identify as absolutely core to having a viable institution in the first place. Rather, my understanding of the standards is that they force schools to be crystal clear on what their mission is and whether or not they are effectively meeting the best hopes of that mission, which requires the school to be in conversation with stakeholders, with denominations, with people who hire their graduates, who benefit from the educational processes through the communities that are led by graduates. So that conversation leads to a different way of understanding accountability that is mission-centered and student-centered, rather than viability of the institution qua institution-centered. So it seems that this is the funny space, as you've said, that many of us occupy in this work of lifelong learning. We often find ourselves having a foot in the institution, but also a foot in the communities that are served by the people who graduate from the institution or who do the work that's represented by the institution. And the clarity of mission, it seems to me, would give us a place to stand when we want to speak back into the assessment cycle of the institution, to talk to them about, hey, you know, these kinds of things aren't happening effectively in communities that are led by our graduates, or we find ourselves in a position where our grads don't know how to, I don't know, respond to a pandemic because they didn't get a class on that in seminary, or other kinds of things that show the degree to which the school has met its goals, as you said before, to produce people who are flexible, able to think, adaptable, able to pilot, experiment. We talked about the willingness to risk failure and to encounter the possibility of not succeeding, and the ability to develop excellent programs. So what we do see within the spirit of the standards is a place to stand to say, hey, we have information that allows us to be part of this conversation loop in the institution.
Right. I think that's right. And I've been following the chat a little bit. There's been a little conversation between Daryl Stevens and Melissa Wigginton. And I think this dovetails nicely with what you're just getting at, Helen. And the question that I saw emerging is, this was Melissa's question. And if you don't mind, I'd love to.
That's where I was going, actually, so you just carry on.
Yeah, so are there, she says, are there continuing education lifelong learning programs out there who have become successfully integrated into a feedback loop to faculty? If we are touted as most agile creativity and responsiveness on the edge, who know congregations, who among you are being listened to or sought after to share what we are learning? So this is one of the challenges for institutions. And one of the things that I think this moment has the potential for opening up, and that moment being the pandemic and all of these changes that are happening in schools, is it provides a space by which schools are willing to think about things differently. Typically, just in my experience in the 20, 30 years of being with schools, in a school, has been that as faculty, I remember we just tended to think very insular. We tended to think the way that we thought of new programs is we kind of put our heads down and thought our best idea, or we had a book idea, we thought that'd be great for a program or for a certificate. And then we would dream up these things as a faculty and then send it out to our marketing people. And then our marketing people would try and get it. And, you know, oftentimes there were crickets. There was like no one who would attend these things. When we were at McCormick, one of the things that we did to help kind of reverse this cycle of program creation was we really began to lean into for us, it was our racial ethnic centers. And the reason for our racial ethnic centers is because our racial ethnic centers were the ones that were the most connected to the church and to the church on the ground. And so what we began to host were these leadership breakfasts, and we bring all these leaders from churches, and we would basically ask what the competency-based folks, competency-based theological education folks were asking their constituencies, and that is, what do you need for your leadership? What kind of things do you need for your ongoing development and professional development as leaders? And it was in these, when we'd have the gathering, for example, of African-American leaders from the South and West sides of Chicago at these breakfasts, that feedback became a loop through which these centers then began to identify certificate programs, and working with maybe one other faculty person, began to then develop into programs. And we eventually created some degree programs based on the feedback that we were receiving from some of these groups. So the feedback from the communities of faith were informing the curricular changes and the program changes that we thought we needed. And the biggest launch that we had, it was probably my last year or two at McCormick, was we created a Jeremiah Wright D-Min program. And our first class for that had almost 40 students, D-Min students, brand new D-Min students. And so what it really taught us was that we could actually think up and dream up curriculum from what were typically thought of as not the kind of center of the faculty, but the center of the racial ethnic centers, or the continuing education centers of the school. So that was one example. My sense is that this was not just an example that happened at one school where I would happen to be at, but I'm hearing this from other schools as well, where that has been the kind of roots of their transformation, when they're actually able to listen to their constituencies on the ground to see what they needed, which then better connected them and began to filter into a process where they could begin to rethink their programming and the programs that the school offered. And those became the most vital elements of that. And that's, again, what we've been hearing all along from the competency-based folks.
That's really helpful, Frank, because there's a discussion going on in the chat about whether it's the job of the ATS schools to actually provide the lifelong learning, or simply to create an appetite for it so that other people like judicatory officials like me do it. And what I'm hearing you say now is when that feedback loop works, the school becomes stronger. And maybe we need to get a stronger sense of what were you hoping that the schools would actually pick up and deliver more continuing education, or are you just wanting to create hungry students for people like me?
No, well, I think it goes both ways. In some ways, vital schools with vital missions are always more healthy when they're serving vital congregations and vital denominations. And I think one of the things, and a lot of the weight that have been put on offices that aren't schools that do continuing education, or denominational offices like yours, is that the weight of connection is trying to bridge such a broad gap that has happened. But what we see that's working for schools is that when, from the school's end, when they begin to rethink their mission and the core of their educational mission in relationship to communities of faith, there's a vitality that the school enters into. And I would say the same thing goes from the other end, from whether it's a denominational center or a regional center for doing continuing education. The extent to which you can be connected to the resources and the ongoing formation of that connects you to those resources in theological institutions, it also provides that kind of vitality as well. That's the issue, is how we bridge that connection that over time has eroded or has really not become as vital. But what we see is when that connection is made, it's healthy both for the congregations, it's healthy for the denomination, and it's healthy for the schools.
Okay, thanks. Helen, over to you, because I think we're getting close to our time here.
Right. Frank, a couple of resources you mentioned in the conversation that we had prior to this. You suggested folks look at The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, R-I-E-S, and the notion of a minimally viable product that allows continuing education, lifelong learning programs to learn how to take smart risk and polish later. And the idea is that you put a minimally viable product out there so that you can have kind of crowdsourced information on how to refine it, which is very different from the head down faculty construct a program from your best ideas and then put it out there that you suggested earlier that also led to often failed programs. So what I'll do when we're in our breakout rooms is pull up that reference so that I can do a screen share so that people can see it. And then you also wrote an article that was published in the Wabash Journal on the future of teaching in theology and religion that you thought might be useful for folks. So I'll share a link to that as well. It seems to me that if we're going to continue in the spirit of creating feedback loops, the role of ALUM is to continue to support people who do this work of lifelong learning, continuing ed, to make the case, to promote it, to engage best practices, and to help establish it as an absolutely crucial part of ongoing vitality in ministry. And I wonder if there's a way that ALUM can serve as a feedback loop back to the association to provide useful information. We don't appear on many of the data forms that you collect. We don't have our own guild that's served by, I mean, not really student personnel or chaos or any one of these other meetings that you host. How can ALUM provide a feedback loop back to the association so that the voices and the experiences that we have from our perch continue to be part of the work that the association's doing? And this will be our last thing before we go over to our small.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think I see there's actually some comment in the chat too about Israel about feedback loops. I think the question about feedback loops is how they're actually listened to. And again, what we're very interested in learning here at ATS is we're really our mission statement is promoting the improvement and enhancement of theological schools, not just period. That's not where the sentence ends, but for the benefit of communities of faith and the broader public. So in our very mission statement, ATS is thinking about the connection between theological schools and communities of faith. And I think one of the vital feedback loops that you can provide us is, again, when you begin to see evidence of that connection where the feedback loop that's coming from communities of faith is actually beginning to get integrated into the educational mission of a school, and where that seems to be working, and then also then enhancing the educational mission or the mission of the school and the vitality of the mission of the school. That's a good piece of feedback that we could continue to hear from you all. I know that there may be some opportunity because we have a resource called Engage ATS, which is basically an online community where you can continue to resource each other. It sounds like you do that pretty well on your own. But this is one of the places where you can give us this feedback. One of the pieces of feedback that I hear right now is the frustration that all of you experience in while you have this feedback, you have this information from these constituencies on how to actually have that feedback land in places where it can improve the curriculum and improve the educational mission of the school for those of you who work in schools. So I just think, again, continuing to have this this process of engagement with each other, because you really are at this place of this vital connection between the communities of faith and the school, and that's what's really vital.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I do hear from Sarah. Yeah, for sure. What we can do is I can work with our communications team and see if there's a way we can maybe facilitate for you to be able to get signed up. You can get signed up on Engage ATS. It's pretty easy. And then it's not too difficult for us, if there's enough energy and will, for us to host, for you all to have a specific group. But then again, I mean, would have to feed this to our communications person.
Sarah and Israel have both been at the forefront of starting a thread on ATS Engage. So we've got some conversation for those of you on the call who are part of an ATS member school. We encourage you to seek out Sarah to find out more about this particular group and see if you can sign up for it. That would be through Lisa Kern at ATS, so it'd be kern@ats.edu. Frank, thank you so much for joining us on your vacation up at Lake Chautauqua, and we hope that you have a restful rest of the week. It's been great to talk with you. I'm going to hand it back over to Steve so that he can set us up for our small groups.
Sure. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you.
Thank you,
to all
Frank.
of you.
It's just great to be able to have some time with you, and I really appreciate your taking this time too. Thank you. Want to invite those of you who can to stay on the line here with us for another 20 minutes or so. We want to take about 10 minutes just in small groups to kind of unpack what we've heard, I guess, and then come back together and have a little bit of plenary discussion about next steps. So as you go into small groups, the question, I'd like you to think about two questions. First of all, what was the biggest surprise or aha moment? What really struck you that you will take away from what Frank said? And what's the next thing you need to think about in your shop, in your institution, in your job, in the place where you minister? So I think our group just barely got started before it was time to stop. I think we should have had a little longer to talk, but I wonder if we could just in the last few minutes open the chat again. You'll have to move your mouse over the screen and pick up the chat from the icons at the bottom of the Zoom window, and just kind of what emerged in your chat, or what has emerged from the day. What were the surprises or the aha moments? Collaborations and partnerships. So I'm going to read these out loud because the recording won't capture what's in the chat. And collaborations and partnerships among all the stakeholders in theological education and ministry are key. In the group I was in, there was some continuing question about whether it's the school's job to provide continuing education or simply to create the appetite. They didn't think that it was clear, which I thought was interesting. Sarah Erickson says this focus on mission. Some institutions may be okay with preparing graduates to look elsewhere, but others will decide to offer robust lifelong learning programs and listen to and incorporate the feedback, and both are okay, she says. Rick Rouse says, I appreciate the comment that schools need to be clear on their mission and whether they are successfully carrying it out. This means they need to be in touch with their stakeholders to measure them. And Helen asks, we've been invited by ATS to participate in a feedback loop. How should we take them at their word?
I'm serious.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like being part of the online group would be a really good start.
Well, and for those who are gathered, Helen is getting ready to help us do some research and to gather some data via surveys. And we would hope that whether you are an alum member or not, by virtue of attending these workshops, webinars, you'll get the invitation to participate. And we would invite you to provide some of that data and help us create a vigorous feedback loop, or recreate a more vigorous feedback loop. And for those of you who aren't aware, I am Sarah Erickson, and I chair the alum leadership team along with several other people here, Stephen Fetter, Erica Knisely, Joshua Lundy Whitler, and Rick Rouse, who are all on this call.
Mm-hmm. So did today's program kind of spark you to do anything in particular, or to take a next step in your institution? Where are you going with this? The stuff that you've heard today? Not sure. Israel says, I'm going to leverage the new standards as much as I can. Asking more questions of the faculty and the academic dean, says Jenny. Helen says, I have a hunch that many of us have more info on the new standards than others in our places. Mm-hmm. A few thumbs up there. So maybe part of our role in institutions, those of us who offer continuing education, is not to sit on the sidelines so much, but to muck in when the discussions get in around what's the mission of the school. A lot of continuing educators, I've had a sense that we aren't always included in those conversations.
It seems to me that one of the invitations a big transition gives us is the opportunity to step into the empty space that's created as we move from the old to the new, and to invite our leadership at our shops in conversation to say, hey, you guys know that this change just happened. This is part of what the shift involves. Let's be in conversation. So that nexus between the old standards and the new standards, and the fact that we have some information about it, give us, I think, some leverage to begin to initiate those conversations in our institutions and put us at the table at the very beginning as somebody who knows more than other people in the shop.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Melissa's pointing out she needs to figure out what's hers to do. Like, what is her role? And that's probably different for different folks on the call.
Well, and the, you know, what is the mission of the lifelong learning component at an institution, and our missions may look different depending on our institutions and where we are housed, and who we bring into those conversations to affect change, if that's where we go.
Part of the role of ALUM in its bylaws and articles of incorporation and all those important documents is to be an advocate for continuing education. That's part of why it exists, and part of why we took it on to host this kind of conversation. We're coming close to the end of our time, trying to get a sense of whether we should have another webinar in August or whether people are all going to be on vacation and we should wait till September. I'd love to have some feedback on that. In the meantime, Sarah, there were a couple of different directions that we wanted to go with future webinars. Do you have do you have those at your fingertips enough that you could say a word about that as the pres?
Well, a couple of areas that we are thinking about going, and we also welcome feedback. Curating some resources and approaches for designing good online learning. We're not clear that we need to design those webinars as much as curate and point people in the right direction or directions for those resources. And then one of the others is helping develop within the network of lifelong learners some identified coaches, mentors, and spiritual directors that could resource our colleagues across the world, really.
Okay.
And as Helen points out, stay tuned for the research rolling out. And thank you, Daryl, for your comment as well.
Absolutely. Friends, it's been a fascinating afternoon, and thank you. Thank you for joining us in the middle of July. Thank you for the comments that you bring and for the work that you do in all of these different institutions that are represented here on the call. The church is remarkably varied, and the varieties of ways that we seek to equip the leadership of the church is obviously just as varied. And what a privilege to be among you today. So thank you.
Well, and a minute of shameless self-promotion, as my colleague Israel Galindo encourages. If you're not a member of ALUM, we invite you to become a member of ALUM to help us with our work, our research, and offering webinars and compensating people to help deliver them beyond trading memberships. And when we get back to face-to-face gathering, helping fund those gatherings. So www.allm.org. I'll type it in real quick.
3 L's.
3 L's.
Yes. Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So I always think of Gollum and his precious. Gollum, precious. It's a terrible mouthful.
All right.
Anyway, friends, Also, if you're, you can also sign up for our e-newsletter there if you haven't signed up for that already, and we'll send out information about that for the next webinar, whether it's in August or September, and we haven't decided yet. Oh, and Joshua is pushing our Slack group, so there you go. Quick,
Multiple channels.
copy that link down before we end the Zoom meeting so that you don't lose it. Any last minute thoughts, comments, questions before we draw this to a close? And feel free to open your mics. There's, nobody's talking over each other now, so we don't need to take the time to type.
If you have ideas for future webinars or topics you'd like to address, let us know.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to thank Stephen for taking time off of his staycation at home. I'm sure he'd like to go back to his wood shop and do some recreation down there. Thanks to each and all, and may God continue to bless the work that we do, the vision that we have, and may God give us the energy to be faithful in all that we do as we do this.